Going back to the 2030 agenda, we have a viewer asking here whether, to your knowledge, there was an explicit recommendation that the Sustainable Development Goals be made into a national strategy rather than only a federal strategy.
Well, I do believe that we recommended that they need to engage Canadians and other levels of government. I'm just looking at Kim because I think our we can only audit at the federal level, so our recommendation would be that we needed to see a federal strategy, but maybe you want to add.
Yes, so again, our audit period ended at the end of November 2017, but we've sort of been noting some of the more recent developments, and there was a news release on the Global Affairs Canada website just on April 17th, which did outline the government's plans to move forward with some of the recommendations that we made. And the plans for a national strategy and national approach are very clear in what the government plans to do.
Thank you. I have a big picture question here from one of our participants who's linking in several ideas. Given the recent budget and also the Auditor General's comments on discrepancies related to responsibility, what are your thoughts on what needs to be done to allocate or reallocate funds or financing mechanisms to support accountability and responsibility?
Wow. So that's a difficult question for me to answer, unfortunately. So as an auditor as a commissioner in the Office of the Auditor General, my role is to audit against federal commitments. The federal government said it was going to achieve a climate target, or it said it was going to achieve biodiversity targets, or it decided it was going to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, or it decided it was going to promote the aquaculture industry and protect wild fish. Once it makes a statement of what it wants to do, we can come in and look at whether or not it's achieving that objective. It's difficult for me in my role to answer the question of the viewer because it's an opinion and our work deals mostly with the facts. You'll note that in our audits, and I don't know if everybody knows this, but the deputy minister of each department has to sign off saying that everything in our audit is factually correct. So in this sort of post-truth era, our audits are the closest thing to what is the truth, if you may, but the allocation of funds is just not something that I can opine in my role.
Thank you. Going back to salmon farming, someone is asking whether there are now legal obligations or timelines for Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the Food Inspection Agency to address the findings and recommendations on salmon farming.
I'll start by answering that. So you'll notice in our audits that we make a series of recommendations and the departments usually agree and they tell us what they're going to get done. There are no legally binding deadlines. The accountability loop in our audit world is one that of Parliament and frankly civil society holding governments to account. So we've made the recommendation, the government has indicated what it's going to do. It's really up to Parliament and civil society to hold that government to account for their future actions. The other tool we can use is to do a follow-up audit. But maybe you want to add any more? Did they give any timelines in their responses?
They did give some timelines in terms of implementation of the recommendations. Some of them are fairly soon, and some of them are next year and the year after that.
But they're not legally binding.
But not legally binding.
Exactly. No. So that's about as far as we can go.
Thank you. You mentioned in your response civil society. One of our viewers is asking in relation to the UN sustainability goals, whether the federal government has put in place any partnerships with civil society organizations to support the achievement of these goals.
Well, during the conduct of our audit, we found that the five organizations that we looked at had done some work on very specific pieces. So Global Affairs Canada did some consultation on the internet and came up with an international feminist aid policy, for example. Environment and Climate Change Canada came out with their federal sustainable development strategy. And in those specific cases, and there were 5 of them, and Kim can probably tell you a few more of them, there was some consultation that was done. I'm not sure that we found any specific partnerships or funding to help. And what you should look at is that announcement that Kim suggested was just made last week about what the government was going to do. But maybe Kim wants to add a little bit more.
Sure. So exactly. On a department by department basis, there was definitely work going on consultation. As Julie said, the Feminist International Policy, Assistance Policy was a good example. Gender-based violence was something that the Status of
There
Women
was a
Canada worked
poverty
very
one
hard
too,
on.
right?
The poverty reduction strategy is something that ESDC has been working quite hard on. So department by department, there's definitely work going on in consultation. However, what we found lacking, and one of the 7 steps that we were looking for in terms of being prepared to implement the Sustainable Development Goals was evidence of consultation and engagement with civil society, with Indigenous groups, with subnational governments, provinces, municipalities. And that's what we found was not there. So the government had not consulted widely on the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 specifically, but department by department there had been work done.
Then this is different because Kim actually did do some work comparing us internationally. And I happened to be part of an expert review panel to help the German government on their sustainable development strategy. And I found when I was talking to the other international peers that their governments had done a lot more to engage their society in the SDGs. People actually knew what they were. In a recent conference that I attended and spoke about our audit, just that the fact that it was coming up, somebody said they had done some research in Canada and found that less than 10% of Canadians even knew what the SDGs. But I know there was a couple of countries that had done a good job in that.
Yeah. So in our audit, we actually looked at and you'll see when you look at it that there are 6 countries that we actually sort of did a bit of comparative work with. And these were countries that had already produced a voluntary national report, for example, that we felt were comparable with Canada. And there were a couple of countries, as Julie said, we did look at Germany, we looked at the UK, we looked at Estonia, we looked at Switzerland.
Norway.
And I'm forgetting Norway. Yes, so Switzerland had done a very good job at consulting, as I believe Norway had as well.
Yeah.
Where they had a full plan on how to engage. And as Julie said, it wasn't just recently. This was sort of back in 2015 when the Sustainable Development Goals were, even before they were approved, there were a lot of countries that did have engagement and consultation at that time, which we found that Canada had not.
That's correct.
Still on the SDGs, we have someone who's wondering whether your audit focused on the implementation of the SDGs within Canada only, or did you also include commitments that Canada has made to help other countries achieve these goals?
That's a great question. I am thinking that we looked at whether or not Canada was prepared to implement the SDGs writ large, so both within Canada and how they would apply them externally. I believe that is what all the Auditors Generals are doing. Is that correct?
That's correct, because unlike the Millennium Development Goals that preceded the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the unique features of the Sustainable Development Goals is that they apply nationally and internationally equally.
So the conclusion in the report that Canada at this time is not prepared to implement, would that also be reflective of Canada's ability to help other countries implement?
Whoa. Help other countries implement? I don't know that we looked at that issue in particular, but that Canada's role in the world in terms of implementing the SDGs at home and in its aid, that's probably what we looked at. But essentially what we were looking for, has the country engaged? And we can say, yes, the country did engage. It signed on to the SDGs. And the Prime Minister spoke at the United Nations and said the SDGs apply to Canada. Then we were looking for the other pieces, right? Was there a plan? Who's the leader and who's responsible? Do they have the resources set aside to do this? and then all the stuff that you need to do to measure, monitor progress in terms of data. And we found that Statistics Canada had done some work on the global indicators. They found statistics for about 70% of the global indicators, but we still don't have Canadian targets, which is what we're supposed to develop. We don't have a Canadian plan. We have 5 departments leading. I don't know how that's supposed to work. How are 5 departments supposed to lead something? That's really too many cooks wrecking the broth, potentially. So we were looking for those things to see whether or not Canada was ready to implement. And in our opinion, at the time of our audit, they were not ready.
Circling back now to salmon farming, is there scientific evidence that salmon farming actually harms wild salmon?
So that's a difficult question for us to determine. What we did was find out if Fisheries and Oceans Canada had done their job in doing the research to find out whether or not aquaculture industry was having impacts on wild fish. So we're not the scientists. I believe the research shows that you looked at, the research shows that there are risks associated with the aquaculture industry in terms of impacts on wild fish. So there's disease transmission, the risk of escape increases the risk of genetic interaction, predation for food, or competition for food. The use of drugs and pesticides, from what we understand, affect particularly wild fish on the floor, on the ocean floor. But I'll pass it over to Sharon.
Yeah, and exactly. There were, the department had committed to undertaking 10 specific risk assessments to look at the effects of salmon farming on wild fish. And they've only undertaken 1. They've got 9 more to do that they've committed to do by 2020. And those will look at other impacts and other types of diseases.
Right. And they also did some work on research on the potential risks, right? So I remember hearing about the research that they were doing on risks associated with escapes and medication and pesticides. So obviously they're doing research on it, which must mean that there are some impacts.
Exactly.
The last thing I'd say about the research question, though, was we found it really interesting. I remember Sharon telling me about this. The research that they do that has long-term funding is actually done sort of in partnership with the aquaculture industry, and it's sort of to support the industry. There's another wave of research that's done that is more short-term, that receives short-term funding, and that is used for the department to do its management and regulatory work, and yet it only receives short-term funding. So the fact that it's at risk of being seen to be promoting the industry, the fact that research for its own work is short-term, but the long-term research is done with the industry also puts the department at greater risk.
Yeah. And I would just add that in terms of the scientific basis, they have not developed, the department has not developed precautionary thresholds below which, for example, a certain species, if the abundance were to decrease, then would that signal a halt in aquaculture activity? They haven't developed that threshold yet. So we can't say whether there is a higher risk. They're still doing the scientific work to determine that.
Yeah. And the fact that they're not actually monitoring the health of wild fish tells us really, in a way, they don't really know. They don't actually know for sure.